The control tower is gone. Not damaged, not degraded, gone. And it didn't stop there. Railway bridges connecting Tehran to Russia and China have been confirmed destroyed. Power infrastructure across multiple regions now offline. Iranian state media is struggling to explain what just happened, but the images don't lie. What comes next could reshape the entire Middle East. The question everyone's asking right now is simple. How did Iran let this happen? And what's the regime planning to do about it? Welcome back to the Professor Jiang Report. I'm grateful you're here with us today, wherever you're watching from across the globe. If you haven't already, please subscribe to stay informed on developments that shape our world, and I'd genuinely like to know, where are you tuning in from today? Over the course of a single operational window spanning approximately 48 hours, the United States military executed a coordinated strike campaign against critical infrastructure targets across Iran. The strikes targeted 3 categories of facilities: the control tower at Chabahar Port, railway bridges connecting Tehran to neighboring countries, and power generation plants supporting military operations. These were not isolated attacks. They represented a fundamental shift in military strategy, moving from reactive responses to Iran's provocations toward a comprehensive dismantling of the regime's economic and logistical lifelines. Chabahar Port sits on Iran's southeastern coast, approximately 250 kilometers east of the Strait of Hormuz. It is Iran's only deepwater port with direct access to the Indian Ocean. This geographic advantage made Chabahar strategically invaluable to Tehran. While American naval forces have maintained a blockade in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, Chabahar offered the regime an alternative shipping route. Ships using this port could bypass American-controlled waters entirely and connect Iran directly to South Asian markets, Gulf of Oman shipping lanes, and broader Indian Ocean trade networks. The control tower that managed all port operations has been confirmed destroyed. Iranian authorities themselves acknowledge the damage, which reveals how significant the destruction actually was. When a military organization has spent months downplaying the effectiveness of American strikes, its admission of damage indicates the destruction exceeded any capability to deny or minimize. The railway targets struck during the same period connected Tehran to Mashhad in northeastern Iran. These are not ordinary civilian rail lines. They sit on the physical corridor linking Iran to China and Russia through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. This overland supply route became increasingly important as sanctions tightened Iran's maritime trade options. Chinese manufactured goods, Russian military equipment, and broader Eurasian supplies flowed through these rail corridors to sustain Iranian economic and military operations. The confirmed destruction of multiple bridges along this corridor severed this connection physically. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, officially acknowledged that these bridges were destroyed and that rail service between Tehran and Mashhad had been suspended entirely. This acknowledgement is crucial. It confirms the strikes achieved their intended effect. Power plants targeted during this campaign supplied electricity to military installations, air defense systems, and critical command and control facilities. By degrading power infrastructure, the strikes reduced Iran's ability to operate its air defense networks effectively and maintain communications across its military command structure. The timing of these strikes was deliberately coordinated. They came during a specific operational window when American assets were positioned for maximum effect and when Iranian defensive systems were most vulnerable to penetration. The authorization for these strikes came from the highest levels of the American military command structure. The decision reflected a strategic calculation that Iran's continued provocations, including attacks on commercial shipping, drone strikes against regional allies, and threats against American military assets, required a more comprehensive response than previous limited strikes. Previous operations had targeted Iranian military units directly involved in specific attacks. This campaign was different. It targeted the infrastructure that sustains Iran's entire war effort. The F-18 Super Hornets launching from the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group provided a significant portion of the strike capacity. These aircraft operated in coordinated formations with other platforms, including F-15E Strike Eagles, which carried precision-guided missiles that could reach targets from standoff distances. B-1B Lancer bombers contributed additional strike capacity. Guided missile destroyers and submarines positioned in the Arabian Sea fired Tomahawk cruise missiles that approached targets at extremely low altitudes below the detection thresholds of most Iranian radar systems. The layered approach meant that Iranian air defense systems faced simultaneous threats from multiple directions at multiple altitudes, making any coordinated defensive response virtually impossible. The strikes occurred as diplomatic efforts to negotiate a ceasefire under a 60-day memorandum of understanding remained theoretically active. However, the military operation signaled that American strategic patience had reached its limits. The regime's 3 primary sources of leverage had all been targeted simultaneously. The Strait of Hormuz leverage had been progressively eroded through destruction of Iranian naval assets. the Chabahar economic bypass, had been struck hard enough that its immediate viability was in serious question. The rail corridor to China and Russia was physically severed by confirmed bridge destruction. What made this campaign strategically significant was not the individual target struck, but rather the comprehensive nature of the targeting logic. The strikes were not punitive in character. They were not calibrated to match a specific Iranian provocation with a proportional response. Instead, they represented a systematic elimination of every economic route and logistical pathway the Iranian regime possessed to sustain its war effort. The message to Iranian command structures was unmistakable. The campaign had moved beyond retaliation into dismantlement. The infrastructure being destroyed was the foundation upon which Iranian resistance to American pressure depended. Without ports, without rail corridors to foreign suppliers, and without functional power infrastructure, the regime's capacity to project power or maintain economic stability was fundamentally compromised. The situation unfolding across Iran in real time reveals a military and government structure struggling to manage simultaneous crises on multiple fronts. Within hours of the initial strikes, Iranian state media outlets began issuing conflicting statements about the scope and severity of the damage. Some official sources claimed that air defense systems had successfully intercepted most incoming munitions. Other sources acknowledged that specific facilities had been struck, but characterized the damage as limited and operationally insignificant. This contradiction between claims and admissions reflects the internal confusion and damage control efforts occurring within Iranian command structures. Official statements from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps confirmed that the control tower at Chabahar Port had been destroyed and that port operations were severely degraded. This acknowledgement came only after multiple international sources and satellite imagery had documented the destruction so completely that denying it became untenable. The IRGC's admission included a statement that port resumption would require extensive reconstruction efforts. In military terms, this translates to weeks or months of operational downtime during which no cargo would move through Iran's primary maritime gateway to global trade networks. The economic impact of this disruption is immediate and measurable. Companies with supply contracts involving Iranian ports are already rerouting shipments through alternative corridors or suspending Iranian operations entirely. The railway damage has been equally consequential. The IRGC confirmed that multiple bridges on the Tehran-Mashhad corridor had been destroyed by precision strikes. The confirmation included an announcement that passenger rail service between these two major cities would remain suspended indefinitely. Military and cargo trains that normally transported equipment and supplies along this corridor are now unable to proceed. Reconstruction of railway bridges requires specialized engineering, construction materials, and time. In the current security environment, attempting major reconstruction projects exposes workers and equipment to potential additional strikes. The regime faces a dilemma: allow the corridor to remain severed and lose supply connections to Russia and China, or attempt repairs while vulnerable to further military action. Power generation facilities across Iran are operating at reduced capacity following the strikes. Multiple power plants that supply electricity to military installations reported damage to turbines, transformers, and electrical distribution systems. The impact on air defense operations is particularly significant. Modern air defense systems require continuous electrical power to operate radar units, command and control centers, and missile launch facilities. Reduced power availability means reduced operational tempo for these critical defensive systems. Power shortages also affect civilian populations in cities where military infrastructure shares electrical grids with residential and commercial areas. Reports from Iranian cities indicate rolling blackouts and reduced electricity availability in sectors previously considered stable. International monitoring organizations have documented thermal imagery consistent with fires at multiple power generation sites. These organizations track heat signatures from industrial facilities to estimate operational status and damage extent. The thermal data shows cooling systems offline and electrical systems non-functional at several confirmed strike locations. This independent verification carries significant weight because it comes from sources without direct involvement in the conflict. When independent monitoring confirms damage that Iranian officials are downplaying, it demonstrates the gap between propaganda and reality. Credible reporting from journalists embedded with Allied military forces in the region provides eyewitness accounts of strike operations. CNN reporters aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln documented F-18 Super Hornets, launching from catapults in continuous cycles throughout the operational window. They recorded the intensity and tempo of flight operations, the coordination between launch and recovery cycles, and the apparent confidence of pilots and flight crews executing these missions. The willingness of American military command to allow international journalists to document these operations directly signals confidence in operational success and represents a strategic choice to make the campaign's effectiveness visibly transparent to global audiences. Military analysts observing the strike pattern have noted the sophistication of targeting information and the precision of individual strikes. The selection of specific facilities, the timing of attacks to maximize cumulative effect, and the coordination across multiple platform types indicates extensive pre-strike planning and access to detailed intelligence about Iranian military infrastructure. The fact that these strikes achieved their objectives without reported loss of any American aircraft suggests that air defense suppression operations were highly effective and that Iranian defensive systems were unable to generate meaningful threats to American platforms. Assessment teams from allied nations operating in the region are currently gathering additional intelligence about longer-term impacts. They are documenting reconstruction timelines, assessing the regime's ability to repair damaged facilities, and monitoring Iranian military responses. Early assessments indicate that the damage to critical infrastructure will require months to repair, and that the regime faces severe constraints on available resources for reconstruction. The convergence of military strikes, economic sanctions, and infrastructure destruction creates cumulative pressure on the Iranian system. The destruction of Chabahar Port represents more than a military setback for Iran. It signals a fundamental disruption to the nation's economic survival strategy. For years, the Iranian regime has invested heavily in Chabahar as an alternative to the heavily sanctioned Persian Gulf ports. The port was designed to absorb cargo that could not move through traditional maritime routes. International shipping companies have contracts with Iranian entities that now cannot be fulfilled through Chabahar. These companies face choices: find alternative routes at higher costs, suspend Iranian operations, or renegotiate terms under worse conditions for Iran. The cascading economic effect extends beyond shipping. It affects pricing for goods inside Iran, reduces government revenue from port operations, and signals to international businesses that investing in Iranian infrastructure is increasingly risky. The severing of rail corridors to Russia and China creates immediate supply chain disruptions. Equipment and materials that Iran depends on from these nations must now find alternative routes, if routes exist at all. Military equipment in particular becomes problematic. Replacement parts for aircraft, tanks, and weapon systems often come from Russian or Chinese sources. Without functioning rail corridors, these supplies cannot reach Iranian military units. The regime must either accept degraded military capability or attempt expensive alternative transportation methods. Commercial goods like electronics, automotive parts, and industrial equipment face similar obstacles. The cost of alternative routes is substantially higher, which means Iranian consumers and businesses pay more for imported goods. This drives inflation and reduces purchasing power across the economy. Power generation degradation has immediate consequences for civilian populations and military operations. Reduced electricity availability forces rolling blackouts in Iranian cities. Hospitals, schools, and businesses operate on reduced power schedules. Citizens face unreliable electricity access just as summer temperatures peak. Water pumping systems that depend on electrical power operate intermittently, affecting water availability in urban areas. The regime struggles with the optics of widespread power shortages while simultaneously attempting to project strength and control. Internationally, power shortages signal to global markets that Iran's infrastructure is deteriorating, which affects currency valuations and investment decisions. Companies considering operations in Iran see unreliable power infrastructure as a major operational risk. The military implications are equally significant. Air defense systems operating on reduced power have reduced radar coverage and reduced response capability. The regime's ability to defend against future strikes is demonstrably diminished. This creates a paradoxical situation for Iranian military commanders. They face pressure to prepare for potential additional strikes while lacking the power infrastructure to operate defense systems at full capacity. Repairs to power generation facilities take time and require materials that may be difficult to obtain. The regime must decide whether to prioritize civilian power availability or military defense system functionality. Diplomatic consequences emerge as these infrastructure losses become undeniable. The regime faces credibility problems with its own population. When state media claims that air defenses are effective and that strikes cause minimal damage, but satellite imagery and international reporting show destroyed ports and power plants, the gap between propaganda and reality becomes obvious. This damages the regime's narrative control and erodes public confidence in official statements. Among regional allies, the visible degradation of Iranian infrastructure raises questions about Iran's capacity to fulfill security commitments or support proxy forces across the region. Nations that have aligned with Iran for protection or economic benefit now question whether that alignment remains strategically sound. The economic pressure compounds existing sanctions effects. International sanctions already restricted Iran's access to foreign currency and international financial systems. Infrastructure destruction adds physical constraints to economic activity. Even if sanctions were lifted tomorrow, Iran would still face months of reconstruction before ports and rail corridors could resume normal operations. This means the economic isolation Iran experiences will persist regardless of diplomatic developments. The regime cannot escape consequences through negotiation alone because the physical infrastructure must be rebuilt regardless of political agreements. Looking at regional stability, weakened Iranian military infrastructure affects the entire balance of power in the Middle East. Nations like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel recalculate their security postures based on demonstrated Iranian weakness. This could reduce tensions if it convinces Iran that military escalation is not viable, or it could increase tensions if the regime attempts to compensate through desperate actions. The path forward from these strikes remains uncertain, yet several critical developments will shape the coming weeks. Viewers must consider what options remain for a regime whose primary economic and military infrastructure has been systematically degraded. Will Iranian authorities prioritize immediate reconstruction of these vital facilities, or will they shift resources toward retaliatory capabilities that risk further American response? The question facing policymakers in Tehran is whether continued resistance serves national interests or merely prolongs economic suffering for the civilian population. International observers should monitor several key indicators in the immediate future. First, watch for any official Iranian statements regarding back-channel diplomatic communications. Reports suggest that unnamed Iranian officials have already reached out through intermediaries expressing interest in negotiations. The identity and authority of these representatives will determine whether any diplomatic track can produce meaningful results. Second, observe reconstruction efforts at Chabahar and the railway corridors. If Iran attempts major repair operations, this signals an intention to restore economic functionality. If no reconstruction begins, it suggests the regime either lacks resources or fears additional strikes against repair crews and equipment. Third, monitor Iranian military posture toward regional shipping and American assets. Any shift toward attacking civilian infrastructure in Gulf states or renewed threats against international shipping would indicate a decision to escalate rather than negotiate. Conversely, a reduction in provocative actions might signal recognition that the current strategy has failed. For those seeking to understand this complex situation more deeply, several resources provide reliable updates. Official statements from the Department of Defense and State Department offer verified information about American operations and diplomatic positions. International monitoring organizations that track thermal imagery and maritime traffic provide independent verification of infrastructure status. Reputable news organizations with correspondents in the region offer on-the-ground perspectives that complement official statements. Viewers should also consider the broader implications of infrastructure warfare as a military strategy. When nations target the logistical foundations of an adversary's economy rather than just military units, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. Civilians feel the effects through power shortages, transportation disruptions, and economic instability. This raises important questions about the ethics and effectiveness of such campaigns, and about the responsibility of international communities to protect civilian infrastructure even during conflict. The next 48 to 72 hours will prove critical. Decisions made in Tehran and Washington during this window will determine whether this conflict moves toward negotiated settlement or expands into wider regional confrontation. The destruction of bridges, ports, and power plants has created a new reality on the ground. How leaders respond to that reality will shape the future of the Middle East and affect global energy markets, international trade routes, and regional security architectures for years to come. From the Professor Jiang Report, this story reminds us that modern conflicts are won and lost not just on battlefields, but in the control towers of ports, the spans of railway bridges, and the power stations that keep nations functioning. When those foundations crumble, everything built upon them faces collapse. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that understanding these connections helps us all better comprehend the world we share.